coming to our panel discussion on Jack Kirby, the comic book apocalypse, graphic world of Jack Kirby. I'm going to introduce Charles, who's the curator of the show, in a second, but just a couple of announcements. The usual things about maybe a cell phone, think about that. And the restrooms are right outside if you need to do that. And then one big announcement is we did receive the catalog a couple of days ago. It turned out very nice. Scott from IDW is here. Thank you, Scott. And so that will be on sale in the gallery after the talk. Now there was one little thing with the catalog, a little hiccup on one of the pages, and we had to put a little sticker on the table of contents page. More have been ordered and will come, but I sort of think in a group such as this, in a certain sense, they would like something like that. So we're going to hold the price down and sell it for the cover price of $39.95 and tax. So that's what the price is going to be. If you're not, come over, look at it, come back to the gallery after the talk, and check out the book, check out the work again. And then also remember, we're open for 2 more weeks. We close October 10th. And I think that's about it. Okay, so Charles Hatfield, professor of English here on campus, will lead the discussion, curated the exhibition. Teaches graphic arts, graphic novel classes, comic classes, and as I say, is in the English department. So I'm going to let him introduce the panelists, and thank you panelists for coming, and thank you all for coming. And we'll see you later in the gallery.
So we're flying by the seat of our pants this afternoon. That seems appropriate somehow, given the energy and the sense of release or escape that you so often see in the work of the great Jack Kirby. We're grateful to be able to mount an exhibition of Jack's work here at Cal State Northridge, and indeed to mount the largest exhibition of Kirby that this country has yet seen. It seems unlikely that Cal State Northridge should be the place, but why not? And the answer as to how that came about has to do with the generosity of Jim Sweeters, our gallery director, who 5 years ago 5 years ago, just after meeting me, he said, "Hey, how about a comic show?" I don't think Jim knew what he was in for necessarily. But since that time, we worked together to bring the comic book apocalypse show into the space. We have a jam-packed panel of Kirby experts, Kirby thinkers, artists and scholars and creators of all stripes. And we're just going to toss back and forth a few broad and we hope generative questions this afternoon. Many of the panelists are actually contributors to the catalog. I hope to introduce them quickly, succinctly. So I'll just start over here on my far left with LA-based artist Steve Roden. Thank you. He's a painter, he's a maker of spaces, of installations, he's a sound artist. He has an exhibition ongoing right now at the Pasadena Museum of California Art. And he can be found online at inbetweennoise.com. He's also an avid collector of comics art. Sitting next to Steve is artist, curator, writer, critic, experimental musician, you name it, Doug Harvey, who could be found online. Doug was for what, a dozen years the lead art critic at the LA Weekly? Longer than that. And it's his writing about Jack Kirby's Fourth World that really brought him onto my radar perhaps 15 years ago. And we're pleased to have him among our catalog contributors. Sitting next to Doug is my colleague and good friend Ben Saunders from the University of Oregon. He's the founder of the Comics and Cartoon Studies program at the University of Oregon, which is this country's first undergraduate liberal arts degree program in comic studies. A first and a program like no other. There's also a Renaissance literature scholar, a pop music scholar, a scholar of comic books and of the superhero narrative, and the co-editor of our catalog, without whom I could do nothing. So thank you, Ben. Behind me left Adam McGovern, a prolific writer of cultural criticism and of comic books. You may have seen him at highlowbrow.com or other online critical venues. Among his comic book creations is the deliriously Kirby-esque collaboration with Paolo Leandri, a recent comic book published by Image called Night World, which is really funky and head-turning and great, so you should check that out. Adam, thank you. To my right from Indiana University Bloomington is the art historian and artist and Andre Malachu, who is the founder of, yes, thank you, Andre. He's the founder of the newly formed center at the IU for the study of comics and sequential art. And his publications include Friar Bernard's Allegories of Love, which is the basis of his Getty exhibition that he curated here in LA some years ago, and also a mind-boggling anthology called Abstract Comics. I think Andre is the foremost authority proponent on the abstract comic genre or movement, and an incredible maker of sequential art in his own right. Andre? Finally, right at the table from Stanford University, professor of film and media studies Scott Buchanan, a fellow comics teacher, like so many here on the panel, another catalog contributor. Scott is the author of The Poetics of Slumberland, Terminal Identity, Matters of Gravity, the BFI Film Classics book on Blade Runner, and forthcoming from the University of California Press, an amazing book called Hellboy's World. Scott Buchanan. So let the record show Steve, Ben, Adam, myself, Andre, Scott, more panelists than you can shake a stick at. So I want to start out with a brief question for every panelist. I'll ask you to swing this on you unexpectedly. I'll ask you to answer this as succinctly as you can. So I'll ask you about your first Kirby comics or Kirby art memory, or an early formative one that sticks in your brain, whether it was delightful or confounding, whether you loved it or were troubled by it. If there's just something like that early in your experience that you can relate to us. Steve?
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The first comic book, I don't know that.
All right, Jack.
I'm a bad speaker either way, so. The first comic that I ever received as a child was from a babysitter named George Levitt, who was completely insane. And when our parents left the house and left me there alone with him, all kinds of crazy stuff happened. And one of the things he gave me that first babysitting night, he gave me Jimmy Olsen. It's 145. It's still, for me, has everything that I'm interested in Kirby's work. There's a collage in the book. Great, crazy monsters in the first 3 pages. Dynamic. I had no idea what to do with it. I didn't read comics as a kid. I just tried to copy the pictures. Those were the best pictures to try to copy. I did it terribly. That's how I became an artist.
Doug? We have a microphone here if you like. Or if you wouldn't like, I'll just hold it. Whatever. Pass it back as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy Olsen. Me too. I'd seen Kirby's work before. I'd read, definitely read Silver Surfer and Fantastic Four. But the first thing that hit me consciously was when Kirby took over Jimmy Olsen, and it blew my mind because it was so strange. The clone of Don Rickles, hippies living in trees and flying cars and so on and so on. It was like suddenly somebody was doing something with comics that was a whole kind of world beyond what was already going on, and it just seemed to open up for me. And close down. Where it's been since, but continue.
I grew up in the UK, so there was no access to American comics was irregular and haphazard, but there was a British Marvel outfit, and they were reprinting the 60s stuff. So I couldn't tell you which particular story it was, but it would have been the Fantastic Four, and the British comics were cheaper and were produced in black and white. So actually my early memories of Kirby, and I think this is important in terms of my own sort of connection to him, was that I was seeing the work in a larger size than the American comics, and always without color. And there was something about the handling of the ink that made it very easy to fall into the page. So that would very young. I'm thinking like memories of Dr. Doom stealing the Silver Surfer's powers, those kinds of stories. That's probably my first Kirby encounter that I can remember.
I think I was conscious of Kirby before I was acquainted with him, by which I mean his style was so pervasive that it was instantly recognizable and definitive of a comic style. I remember only now I have memory, like for the first time in 46 years, of envisioning a comic that I wanted to do that I know was patterned on the compositions of Kirby. Some like hero, kicking in the face like some strangely arranged colonnade of Nazis or something. This kind of weirdly set up action. I think, I'm not sure, I must have become aware of who he was, which guy was doing this stuff with the Fourth World. And the things that stand out for me are really kind of like a civic education. I mean, I'm a writer, and I approach Kirby from a textual direction. And it was kind of like my civic education, like when Isaiah talks about, where is Isaiah, the servant of those he leads? All of this kind of Nixon era, yearnings, for a truer democracy. Or like when Richard, I think it is in The Glory Boat, says, oh, I'm a conscientious objector, I'm opposed to all killing and violence. And Lightray says, I know a place where everyone's like that. Like Kirby was showing me, that's the kind of future I liked Kirby showing me. A little afield of your question, but it was what made an impact on me.
I can't really remember when I wasn't reading Kirby. I used to say that Mandy, the last one, number 32, which is a double-sized issue, was the first one I bought with my own money, my allowance money, which I didn't really earn, but my parents, bless them, gave me anyway. Although I now realize I had a lot of Kirby memories prior to that, and I don't remember how that's possible. So, for example, there's a page in the gallery from the Demon number 14, which I can remember reading in front of the television at my grandmother's house. I learned the word doppelganger from that page. Doppelganger, sounding that out. So it seems like the stuff was always there, but it became a particular passion of mine when I was old enough to run around and ride my bike and go buy comics at age 10, and it became sort of like a quartz vein in my head that stayed there from then on. Okay. You go, Mike, there.
Okay, sure. Hi. Actually, I was hoping that Ben would rescue me from this because I seem to have come later than anybody else to Kirby than anybody else in this panel. I grew up basically reading French comics, and only my family moved to America, and only when I was about 18, 19 did I even deign to begin reading American comics. When The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, all that came out, I realized, my God, it was really great. Because before that, around 1980, I had seen like one issue of Spider-Man. Like, what is that compared to I don't know who had done that compared to French comics. And then I think my path then took me circuitous ways, and I think really only did I truly begin appreciating Kirby at about age 30, or maybe even a little bit my early 30s. So I don't know if I have a single memory, perhaps Sandman number 1. Sandman number 1 from 1974, which has that amazing silent page. It has five panels that was written by Joe Simon. Kirby rarely was that silent, but Simon wrote to the silent part. And 5 beautiful silent panels, and all of a sudden that just really struck me as, this is what comics can be. and it was amazing. So that.
It occurs to me, this probably isn't the first instance of it, that I'm now noticeably the oldest guy on the panel. So my memories of Kirby go back a bit further. I was buying Fantastic Four back in not only the 1960s, but around the 60s in the run of Fantastic Four. And I bought quite a few comics at that time, as many as I could afford. There weren't as many comics then. And I bought most religiously the Fantastic Four and the Stan Lee, John Romita Spider-Man comic. And at some point I became very aware of the fact that I was constantly rereading the Fantastic Fours in a way that I was not rereading the Spider-Mans, much as I liked them. There wasn't as much for me to get on a second go-round on the Spider-Mans. There was always something new to get in encountering the Kirby pages again. There was something inexhaustible about what was being opened up there. And you know, that's my primary engagement. It's from that time on. A more specific memory is that when I was younger, I went to comics conventions. I don't do that so much anymore. And in my teens, I went to one, and my father wanted to know what this was about, so he came with me. He was dumbfounded by the whole experience. But there was a room where Kirby was exhibiting some of his recent DC work. This is just before the Demon came out, Demon #1. And I was walking around the room mesmerized by the artwork, and my father was the same age as Jack Kirby, and they started telling war stories to each other. I don't remember any war stories that they told. I can't share anything. But Kirby was just so happy to have a grown-up in the room. And I felt so glad that I could have provided that experience by proxy.
Let's have a stationary mic and a floating mic. And do that. So I want to pitch a question, and I may pitch it at you first, Andre, given the fact that your writing has been inspirational for the question, but I want to take the question to everyone. You know, from the point of view of the curator putting the show together, there's always been this tug of war between the comic book as a kind of hand size or intimate object, an object designed for reading, right? And comic art as something that can fill a gallery, that can shape or define a gallery space, that can be spectacular, that can be on the walls, that seems to get a different kind of attention. To walk through the gallery, you may pay a different kind of attention than you would if the 7 by 10 inch comic book, for example, is in your hand. So we're really dealing in our exhibition with work that was designed for comic books or comic strips. The great majority of pieces across the street in the exhibition were made for that purpose. So it's production art, right? It's not art that was primarily made for exhibition, it's production art. And there's some debate about what that means when you take production art and you sort of wrench it from its original purpose or context and transpose it into a different context. And so I've thought about that productive tension between spectacle, or what I hope will be a spectacular gallery experience, and the readability of comics. And that's a question that we face increasingly as comic strip and comic book art finds its way into galleries and into museums in a way that it hasn't before. So I wanted to ask all of our panelists. Andre, you've written about this more often and more productively, I think, than other scholars of late. And Andre has an essay called Permanent Ink that's available online that really speaks to these issues. What is gained and or lost by that transposing of comic books from the readable hand-sized form to the gallery wall?
Well, if I can address a couple, and I've written about this for so much, I teach about this so much that I think I'll try to be very brief, so as to let other people talk about this. But 2 points I want to make. If you've ever seen a Michelangelo drawing in a museum, that was production art. People did not begin appreciating the drawings as works in their own right until the late 17th, early 18th century, when people began collecting them. Actually, literally the collector market, the same way as the collector market in original comic art, had a lot to do with that. And we could discuss the historical transformation, but art does begin transforming. I think we are at a point where what at one point was considered to be purely production art, as we know, by basically being given away or trampled in the various publishing houses storehouses, and so on, begins bringing a lot of money. Of course, when something brings a lot of money, it becomes much more valued. But there are a lot of other considerations. For example, there are more and more museum shows of comics. As comics gaining respectability, and therefore, cultural institutions are taking notice and want to put on shows, and a piece of comic art, a half of it, especially a twice-up piece of comic art, tends to have a wall presence that that somebody a comic book doesn't have. And also you have sort of the autograph hand of the artist, or at least the inker, on there. And therefore you can somehow, relate to that work of art by sort of saying, for example, seeing, the motion of the hand very differently than you see it reduced on the comic, in the printed comic. But I think from that point of view, again, in my mind, you end up focusing so much more on the visual and not simply treating the comic as a consumable thing that provides, every panel provides a little quantum of narrative. You go to the next one, the next one, the next one. In a way, it forces you to stand there and look at it. I was trying to read the comics in here. It's much harder to read a comic on the wall than to actually read it again in printed form. And lastly, the last thing I was going to say is that currently there are more and more alternative art comics creators who basically create as much for the book as for the wall. So I think that goes hand in hand with this. Gary Panther, but people before Thunder, and so on, Paper Rad, who are creating comics with the intent of them being as much, museum comics as, gallery comics, as of them being book comics. So I think that from this point of view, comics is undergoing, yet another transformation, the same way as it maybe it underwent with the graphic novel. So.
Doug and Steve, I'd like to toss this question over in your direction, given your experience, and then we'll have other people give a question as well.
This is for me, it's a tough question. I mean, I think, we're all talking about this as original art or production art. Nobody's calling it production junk or, production stuff. And there are things that were drawn by human beings. Seeing a single panel on the wall is not the same as sort of necessarily knowing the story. But as an object, a visual object that offers a bunch of stories, a lot of questions, a lot of unbelievably views of the world and language, architecture. I mean, there's just so much going on in these things that they don't seem, at least in my mind, well, I collect art, so obviously I'm invested in it as objects that are meaningful on their own. Like I said, I didn't read comics when I was a kid, so I think they're visual stories in a lot of ways. And
Would you say that the gazing came before the reading for you?
absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I didn't know much about comics when I was reading them as a kid, and I didn't know that there were different inkers. I didn't know why certain characters look different in different books, in different people's hands. It's kind of a mess in a way for a kid, like Silver Surfer, Kirby Silver Surfer, and then seeing Bruce Willis Silver Surfer. They look so different. Who did this? Why is this like this? I didn't know any of that stuff until I was probably in my 30s. Going back to childhood books and realizing who were the artists that I responded to. But I'm a person who has collected junk my entire life, and it's the value of something is the relationship I have with that object. I don't want to be hoity-toity, but Benjamin talks about book collecting in that way. He really talks about the owner of the object having a relationship with that object. And the person lives in the object, and that relationship's tight. So when I pull out some of this art and I look at it, I see things differently every time I look at it. We don't want to get into a definition of art. I'm not going to touch that. But I don't see the difference. These are things that people made. Either you like what they made or
it's not just nostalgia. I mean, I have pages from books I never read. Whatever it hits you, it's just like music.
May I ask, can you all hear back there?
I like your last point, having pages that you haven't, from books you haven't read. I think it's, I really don't like shows of text on the wall. I don't like Raymond Pettibone shows, comic art shows. I mean, I like it, but I'd rather read a comic book than see the art on the wall. But the one thing I think is that when the narrative gets fragmented and you have pages pulled from here and there and grouped together thematically, it allows you to shift your attention to the art rather than the narrative, because I find reading comics I often overlook the art, even though I'm primarily a visual person. I'll get sucked into the story and just sort of jump ahead without sort of appreciating the subtleties of the artwork. And I think that putting it in this kind of context where, except for the Commandy story, but everything else pretty much is chopped up right now.
There will be 2 complete stories in the show, and that might be me, the English professor, who doesn't encourage reading, right? Although I myself can't read those stories in the gallery without my feet hurting. It takes so long to stand and read them, but I wanted them to be there. So now Ben has curated several comic art shows at the University of Oregon. He's curating one on DC Comics now, and so he is also an English prof, like me, but he has curatorial experience that I lean on very heavily.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about your question actually is that there is this tension between looking and reading is inherent in the form. So it becomes aggravated by the gallery circumstance, but actually, and this is a point that in some ways I think I owe to Scott's work on Hellboy, where a book that I would recommend to everybody. It's kind of nicely done. Where one of the things that Scott points out in that book is that when you see you actually pointed this out in a lecture where you had a comparison between a Hellboy battle scene and then a sequence from one of the movies. And the point was not to say that the movies are not as good, but that they do. Comics are essentially about to blow, even when what you're looking at is a very dramatic action. So you might be looking at one of these double-page Kirby spread, or even a single-page spread like the opening of the New Gods or something, where you look, which is in the show, where you're looking at these mass ranks of armies that are about to engage in an extraordinary battle. But if you turn the page too quickly to find out what has happened next, and in some ways the project is, Kirby wants you to stop, even at moments of high action, in order to absorb the action. I think it's something unique about the form. It's one of the things that I really love about the form. And when I come, and it's why, I have nothing against superhero movies, for example, but it's why I would rather read comics than go to see films a lot of the time. Because the experience is different. Action happens in a different kind of way. Temporal unfolding is different. And I think the gallery experience can actually show us that. It can teach us something about what it means to read comics. We can learn actually that when we read comics, we're not looking a lot of the time because of the way we're being dragged through the narrative. But another piece about this, just to say this because it makes me mad, I think it's really a crime that it's taken this long for someone like Kirby to get the due that he's finally getting. And there's a lot more work that could be done, and an awful lot more celebration that could be done. And this person gave us not only a visual storytelling vocabulary that has influenced hundreds of people, but he gave us what is a version of the 21st century imagination. You can't walk into Walmart without finding Kirby images embossed on every available surface. This isn't going to go away, folks. This stuff that mattered to people who read the comics, maybe even these comics that weren't even selling that well for some of us, Fourth World in the 70s. This is only the things that you're exposed to when you're 5. We've got a whole generation that is now being exposed to this stuff on a daily basis in every format. And they're going to want to know about the source. And they're going to realize that much of the source of this is Jack. So I think this is just the beginning, and if the big museums in the culture had invested in comic art a long time ago, there would already have been a Kirby show at the moment. but because they don't own any of this stuff themselves, these institutions are frankly too corrupt to invest in artists that they don't own. I really think that's true. So good for university museums.
I just want to sort of add that I think that what you're saying is more an indictment of the art world and its claim to having some kind of authority to validate what Jack Kirby did or any comic artist. I think that kind of, it doesn't really carry through that way, and it's kind of an indication of the waning legitimacy of art world institutions rather than they're taking time to catch up. I don't think there's any catching up to do. I think that's on its way out as a model of sort of validating art.
Like perhaps many of us, at least who had hand-me-down comics from older siblings, I read comics as visuals before I had the ability to read text. And I remember, just like imposing narrative and extracting meaning, from specifically Kirby comics, Captain America's, Thor's. And even today, certainly Ben raises a great example of the opening panel of the New Gods, where, and there's some artists today that I'll do this to, like do this with as well, like when Eric Larson did a recent issue of Savage Dragon that was all in double-page spreads, and there was not a lot of text, but I found my eye reading the details of the imagery because it was packed with incident. There's kind of like a wavering partition for me between that looking and watching and the even reading and watching. Interestingly enough, I find that for the stories that are complete in the gallery, I'm just picking out little details and phrases like the commandy thing. There's this great scene where he's like beating up this gladiatorial foe, and he goes, instead of cursing at him, he's going, stupid, arrogant, pampered, brutal little tyrant, which of course is all of Kirby's rage at the people who had abused and like exploited him, or would not see him fulfilled. In the same way that people like Lichtenstein would just extract single, definitive statements from comics, the way that, just certain slogans or ideas, stick in our consciousness out of the stream of media. To me, like comics, even when I'm reading them in my hand, that kind of pop art headline, is what sticks in my mind. I mean, I was quoting some of them in my previous answer. And the monumentality, I don't know, I think that intimacy places you in the scale of the monumental. I mean, when you're holding a comic in your hand, it's filling up the world, you're immersed in it. So, and of course, the trend in entertainment is to smaller and smaller, frames for things. I don't think things are necessarily lost or gained because, I'm kind of reliving the monumental experience I felt from a Kirby panorama, whether I see it as a tiny panel in a page on the wall here or a blown up, like the murals are.
I think everybody on the panel has made really good points, and what I want to talk about touches on a number of them. One thing that you might get from the gallery ball and the original artwork is a sense of size and scale. Kirby drew big things, and to see the artwork large gives you, the art is a little more overwhelming. It doesn't just draw attention to itself more, but it is more striking. And yet, in working on the Hellboy book, I was trying to figure out, clearly Kirby, the question I asked myself was, can comics do the sublime? Large-scale paintings by Church or Turner do the sublime really well, the overwhelming power of nature on a museum wall. Cinema does the sublime really well. 2001, Pacific Rim do the sublime quite well. Comics, though, are, to use Adam's word, an intimate medium. You hold them in your hands. They don't seem to have that power to overwhelm like these other media do. But the bottom line is, my first experience of the sublime was Jack Kirby, were the Fantastic Four and Thor comics, where concepts like Ego, the Living Planet, and the Negative Zone, and the Inhumans were being unleashed on me, not to mention those photo collages where we go into another dimension and another realm of representation. And Kirby would, Charles has written beautifully about the subject matter of Kirby's work and how it ties in to the technological sublime, but it's also in the form, the way that Kirby would move from a 6-panel page to a 3-panel page, to a full page, to a double page, and just, really use the fixed scale of the comic, but vary the size of the panels in a way that opened up onto larger experience. So comics create a really unique experience of kind of intimate sublimity, or not all comics do, but when the sublime is being deployed, it's a very intimate sublimity and quite unique. So there's something to seeing the art on the wall and giving it this breathing room and seeing it outside of its narrative context. But then there's also that extraordinary experience of reading. I'm very fond of both experiences.
Just one or two things about this. One, it struck me that from what Scott said, it's true that you need to have a size, but also another place to get a sublime from in romantic period was poetry. And again, poetry is held in tiny books in your hand. Sorry.
I have to go back and edit.
But secondly, I was actually trying to read the 2 stories on the walls. I was able to get to the one, I was not able to get to the Thor one, and that had to do a lot with Stanley's words, which were so many of them on the page. And what struck me, though, is that Kirby, even when he writes, so to speak, visually. I don't know if this makes sense, but somehow his words are of a piece with the visual progression of the comic itself. And while there's a kind of separation when reading Fantastic Four or Thor or whatever, and you're actually trying to read, the heavy captions. I counted, one kind of 12 words, and you're trying to get through all that, and it really slows you down. Kirby usually uses fewer words, especially in the word balloons, and actually you get the speed of really going through the panels, and somehow because moving them faster, it almost becomes animated. You sort of seeing one visual composition or another visual composition, and then you perceive them within the context of a page, and so on. And you have a very different graphic reading experience in reading things that Kirby wrote and drew himself, rather than things that he drew but were scripted, or dialogue by somebody else. So.
The way I would put this is that Kirby might draw up a story on the boards and have a character like Thor say, "Let's go," and the end comment might say something like, "Tarry we here no longer, but let us leave forthwith." And that's cool in a way, but it also thickens the reading experience. I mean, one thing that is sort of implicit in the exhibition, because there's a complete story from Thor in 1968, and then there's a complete story from the Commandy series about 5 years later, is you can see how those different comics were produced. Thor was produced at Marvel through the office and under the editorship of Stan Lee, through a process that had involved many more hands, right, actually getting on work, whereas Commandy was produced in a relatively streamlined manner. And if you get a chance to look at those pages and compare and contrast those pages, see how much marginalia and how much kind of dirt there is under the fingernails of the Thor page to the Marvel comics, and how many hands have touched those, and then compare it to some of the ones that, as Andre mentioned, were more nearly written or entirely written by Kirby himself. It's not to denigrate one or elevate the other, but they're made in different ways. You can kind of see this in the exhibition.
Can I have this one? I have a rejoinder to Andre. It took me a couple of minutes to think of it. Yeah, poetry in the sublime, check. But the language in comics rarely aspires to sublimity, to the evocation of the sublime, whereas the visual imagery in comics often does. I think it's on the level of the visual that comics most often aspire to the sublime. And one would think they might be hampered by their size and the limitations of scale, and yet, as I was saying,
I much appreciated what Andre was saying about there being a visual character to Kirby's writing. And it really is true. I mean, it's an aestheticized text in, of course, his infamous overuse of quotation marks, hyphens. He's wrestling with how to describe things which he's only becoming aware of himself, these kind of, you know, fifth dimensional concepts. And even like the deployment of text, the way that, you know, all the fourth world stuff in like Commandy's chapters would, you know, start with this, you know, floating text over the first panel, like this kind of proscenium for the story. But I also think that Kirby was attempting the sublime in this kind of wording too, because he was like kind of grappling with a language for something that we have no, you know, way to process yet.
Okay, Adam, read this. Okay, this is from the opening first page of New Gods 1. It's at the start of Doug's essay, the catalog. Just read that.
There came a time when the old gods died. The brave died with the cunning. The noble perished, locked in battle with unleashed evil. It was the last day for them. An ancient era was passing in fiery holocaust.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's the first page, and it begins with the word epilogue, which I always
Right.
love.
Yeah, it's a comic that begins with the word epilogue, and then everything is forward from there. I want to go on to something that you mentioned specifically, and it's one of the things that we're fortunate to have in the exhibition. We do have 5 of these collages that Jack Kirby created. Scott has written about them eloquently in the catalog. Steve and I have discussed them at length because you're the collector and great admirer of those. I was asked by an interviewer if the collages were just a sideshow to the main event, or if I saw something really that was crucial in those. We have 5 collages on the wall. 4 of them are actually, again, production art. That is, they were used for comic books. One of them is a piece that's never seen publication anywhere, and I was given to understand that Jack Kirby made a lot of these at home in his, copious spare time, because drawing and writing 80 to 100 pages of comic book narrative a month was not enough, but he kept a more filing of clippings around, and as gifts to family or as exercises for himself, he made these things unbelievably while he was not working for pay. I hope that you've had a chance to look at those, or we'll look at them this afternoon. But starting over there with you, Steve, I want to ask you, what do you glean from those? What kind of affinities to other art or just inspirational elements that you see in those, or why those are particularly fascinating? I don't see them as a sideshow. I see them as somehow central, but I'm at pains to explain why.
Because they seem to test the language of the visual language of the book. I mean, you turn the page and suddenly everything isn't made up of lines anymore. It's made up of images. And I didn't remember seeing those as a kid, and about maybe 5 years ago, I started to look at some of the books I had as a kid, and I started doing some stuff on the internet, and I found an image of one of these collages, and I was like, well, if I wasn't I was going to say something else, but it was like, holy cow, right? And I didn't remember them. I hadn't heard anyone talking about them. I didn't know they existed, and so I found an image somewhere on the internet doing something, and so then I started to look into the history of them and the books. They were pretty early. Some of them were pretty early. And then it just got me really excited. I'm really interested in artists who stray, who have sort of like a central sort of program in the middle of their practice. But I'm a painter. I work with sound. I've done all kinds of different things. And I think to see someone stepping away from what they know, to see their experiments in a lot of ways. And I think he's such an experimental draftsman. And then to see him. These things are, they're very complex, and they're full of tons of little pieces of bits of things. Some of them are simpler, but I think the idea of him trying to integrate those into the books is so interesting, because then you can't really talk about them as being like stuff he was doing on Sunday in his studio. He tried many times to insert them into the narratives. So to me, I'd never really seen anything so unconventional in a regular comic. And so I think they're incredible. There are, Victor Hugo made drawing from teeth. There's just a whole history of
secondary work that at times is just as interesting, if not more so, than their primary practice. And so I was just completely obsessed with them when I first discovered them, and I had a couple of them, and I think they're underrated.
We actually have, I think, the last collage that was published in a comic book in Kirby's lifetime in the show because Steve loaned it to us. So you should definitely check that out.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, Scott.
Let me just quickly about the collages. First of all, one of the reasons you might not have noticed them reading them in the books is they were so badly printed. And so, for me as a kid, these were the pages to sort of, muddle through rather than something that really. However, when better reproduction came on, or when I saw photographs of the original art, that's when they really blew me away. And then made me begin to realize how often, and especially in the 70s, he was using it to represent worlds beyond our own, dimensions beyond our own. And what's fascinating about that is that in his 2001 comic, which I like immediately because it's bigger, so more immersive, but in that one he uses photo collage in the most banal ways to just put the photographs of the various spaceships together. But in the Beyond the Infinite sequence of the film, where Doug Trumbull's special effects sort of take us out of the realm of representation, Kirby lets loose in drawing. He uses his drawing as the mode of entry into another dimension, rather than a collage in that where he kind of inverts his own strategy. It just intrigued me.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw a couple of ideas out. One about the Sublime, just to reactivate that. Illuminated manuscripts and Kirby's horror vacui. So to me, like, the Sublime can come from small, intricate, dense information networks. If you shift your attention so that it becomes a larger space through contemplative attention. That's one. And I also think there's something sort of fundamentally collage-y about Kirby's entire approach to writing and drawing as well as doing collages. I think what you were saying about his language, what Andrew was saying about his language being visual, I think backs that up. There's a sort of discontinuity where, Stan Lee is like very sort of discursive and sort of on it. Kirby sometimes, it seems to shift tense and I don't know what the hell he's talking about, but it doesn't matter. And then on another level, the stiches that he gets into in this period of like pulling together Planet of the Apes and all these other different cultural references and things is just sort of I think a way of understanding storytelling and visual art and communication that's rooted in sort of collage revolution of the 20th century.
We've always had a simple word as postmodern, as people say that, but it seems almost like a violation of the spirit to apply that word, which Kirby doesn't need for our appreciation, but yeah, it's like the mix master par excellence. It's here, there, and everywhere.
If I could just make one quick point about in my article in the catalog, I actually talked about a drawing by Kirby. But if you actually look at the drawing itself, begin with, Kirby Tech. Kirby Tech basically looks like circuit boards. And almost as if those were kind of drawn and collaged into. There are parts of his university buildings that look basically taken from, blinds, like on window blinds. And there are shadows, which basically look like Holstein cow markings. So you can sort of see, cut down the various little elements that he's using. And things is a collage element to the way he actually builds cities and machines and so on, which again you sort of see it in the collages where he basically takes a washing machine or something and that becomes a propeller or a jet on a spaceship or something. But you can actually sort of see the same procedure in the actual drawing that he does.
Oh, I just
just think I think the collage analogy that Doug was coming up with is very productive. I think I think he's associative as creatively in a Shakespearean way, and by which I mean that the gift is enormous, but I think it's very instinctive too. And I don't mean that Kirby gets patronized a lot, and by people who ought to know better. You know, I mean, I recently read a comment from Art Spiegelman where he said he was finally starting to appreciate Kirby's primitivism or something like that. This is a belated acknowledgement that maybe there's something there, even if that idiot didn't know what he was doing. And I don't mean it that way. I don't mean that Kirby isn't a thoughtful creator, but I think he is. But I don't think theory particularly interested him because he's driven by other forces. He's driven by, a lot of the time he would probably define it commercially. You know, he's driven by the desire to make money to feed people. But that's not, you know, clearly that's a cover story after a while. No one, you know, the amount of pages he's producing. There's a way in which his foot has been on the gas for so long that he doesn't know how to let it up. But I also think there's when you read something like Commandy and you see that there's sort of a Planet of the Apes knockoff, but then he decides, oh, this week I'm just going to do the story of King Kong, except it's not really the story of King Kong because the person in the Fey position is actually going to be Commandy. But I'm not really going to think about what it means to flip the gender here. I'm just going to do it and see what happens. And then at the end, and so is it funny or is it a pastiche by the end when the big ape falls? Because there's no way it's a surprise. You know that you're reading King Kong by 3 pages in, right? But when the ape falls and says, tiny hurt, and me no can play with you anymore. And you feel it here. And so, I mean, I don't make the Shakespearean comparison lightly. I think that there are ways in which you don't have to work with a conscious intent to super saturate the thing that you're doing with all of these symbolic meanings for them not to be there. They end up being there anyway. Just because the creative process, because the faucet is just open, and the culture is coming out, and Kirby's influence has just come out, his experience has come out in this fantastical, very genre-driven, still maybe kind of a children's medium way. There's nothing else like it. So it's endlessly fascinating, and I think collage is actually a pretty good metaphor.
Sure. Well, of course, speaking of intuition and just the sheer pleasure and wonder of these things. I mean, when those collages were being done, I was too young to be dropping acid, so those were my sort of deal. It was these mind-blowing strange things, which I associated with things like sequences in Yellow Submarine and stuff like that. But I know it's not uncommon to say that Kirby was anticipating Photoshop and what would he have done with it. The collages to me clearly show him straining against the limits of the expressive limits of his medium. Though there's something about the limitations of them that I find really illuminating. I mean, the flatness with which things are applied is almost like the best we can see something from a higher dimension, and thus it speaks to Kirby's sense of there being other realities. And just the way, I mean, now that I think back, I really liked coming upon those because they have these weird pastels. Even some of the printing flaws that you were talking about, seem to aid that. The fact that you're from this 4-color universe into this weird faded newspaper look, and it's Kirby reaching into the broader world of media and of our visual and conceptual experience of those times. Like they've fallen into a universe of Kirby's cut-up magazines.
Why did you never do a collage comic from beginning to end?
Mark Evanier tells us that the negative zone, which is a plot point in the Fantastic Four series, was conceived with this in mind. That initially, the idea behind the negative zone was that it would only ever be rendered in collage. That idea lasted for about 1 page, every page, right? Because the production standards of comic books, or just the production line at Marvel, could not tolerate this. But he at one time had a notion that he would have whole sequences, stories, or chapters that would be set in this. I mean, the usual answer given is that it was just too hard production-wise.
And was it also more time-consuming when you do a collage page than to do a drawn page?
I know a lot of people, when I was young, viewed these as cheats, like, oh, he didn't have to draw a page, but that seems silly to me. I had an experience walking through the gallery with one of our painting instructors here at CSUN, who had seen some of the work when he was young, someone who practices abstract painting and teaches it, and he was sort of reconnecting or just learning what this stuff looked like. And we walked through the gallery together, and he really looked at the collages particularly, and he said, oh, his visual language is the same in the collages or in the drawings. Something frankly difficult for me to see, because I've been reading the comics for so long. I said, yeah, you're right. And he said, what, did he spend all of his time in this sort of visual world in his own head? I said, yes, he did. I think he did. So we usually hear the production impediments were the problem there. I always thought they looked cool myself in the comics. I want to divert to a different issue. I had a delightful experience a few weeks ago when one of the Arts Council volunteers here started following me around the gallery. Two of my colleagues had come in, folks that I knew from my college, and I was showing them around some of the work. And one of our volunteer docents from the Art Council, whom we've been speaking to earlier that day, said, is this a guided tour? She's running. I joined in, and I had the longest conversation with her, and she said she'd never seen comics of this type. She had no knowledge of comic books. She was encountering this work for the first time, and she said to me, with reference to one or two or three or four different images in the gallery, she said, he's really drawn to the dark side. And I thought, well, yeah, but let me show you this touching page with the baby over here on the other wall. She asked me, does it not depress you? I said, well, no, and it didn't when I was 10 years old either. It excited me. But it made me think about the various claims people make about Kirby, his biographers and his fans. For some, he's an eternal optimist. He's sort of an always sunlit kind of personality. Because hope is part of what he deals in. I don't know that I necessarily read the comics that way, and I wonder if among the kind of works that we pulled into the gallery, if any of you have a read or response to that, is it utopian? Is it dystopian? Is there a vast beyond darkness under your feet when you read it, or is there brightness? I mean, maybe you have thoughts about that.
I just heard Glenn Bill talk about this in the gallery. So.
Glenn? Yes?
Well, hi.
Hi.
Glenn David
One of the
Gold,
contributors.
novelist, catalog contributor, and lender to the show. Big help. Thank you, Glenn.
My own, I don't know if you can hear me from over here. No, my own feelings about Kirby's optimism or pessimism is that I think that there are flip sides of the same coin. I think that it depends on, I wrote, the essay I wrote in there is called The Red Sheet. It's about his World War II experiences and how he brought post-traumatic stress disorder to Captain America. And what I think in the original essay I wrote, which is way too long, and I learned for the first time in my life to actually cut something down, is that at one point in World War II he talks about how when he came out on Omaha Beach, that's when he understood that there was a God. And then later in the same war, he understood there was no God. So it was as if there was flip side of violence on one side. It was an affirmation to him of there being some sort of guiding light. And at the same time, other types of violence made him think that there was none. So I think that actually what he was a fully rounded, mature person who understood that there sometimes were causes for optimism and sometimes causes for extreme pessimism.
I think he almost had a kind of a Buddhist understanding of like destruction being necessary for regeneration. He deals so much with youth and affirming the youth culture of the times in books like The Forever People. I know there's this one opening sequence in Forever People #5 maybe, or this council of juniors is appealing to Highfather to reverse some decision of his, and like the caption says something like, on New Genesis, the young have a voice. So he was very much endorsing, the 18-year-old vote and other, opportunities for participation in society for youth. And I think he really saw, it was a generational story, the Fourth World. He saw those who came after him as the ones who could benefit from what he had fought for. Kind of, I don't want to go so seriously as to say it's to liken it to in Mouse, where, Artie's shrink tells him that he's the true survivor, not Wladek. But I think, Kirby had that conception, that he had, fought up to a certain level, and, there were other people who would enjoy the fruits of this. But, so he kind of was entropic in conceiving of his own fate, but optimistic for subsequent generations.
Remember this bit where he tells Orion that this is the Highfather, he's kind of a Moses-like patriarch, really. And he tells Orion, the fierce warrior, before they have sort of a war council, before they talk about serious matters, he says, first, Orion, we bow to the young, right? And they sort of bow to this group of children that are there. We bow to the young because they represent the future. And then the plot moves on from there. It's a very telling moment. Anyone else have thoughts in response to Glenn or to the question?
Yeah, I just want to footnote Glenn's point, which is really, obviously a really good one, but to say that Kirby also didn't polarize good and evil. It wasn't like a Manichaean, dichotomy that just was inviolate. In the New God Saga, which we've been referencing a lot today for obvious reasons, if you've read it, the main character, Orion, is the son of the darkest villain in all of comicdom, but he is living among the peaceful people, and Mr. Miracle, the hero of another book, is the son of the good utopian society, but forced to grow up in this more dystopian. So this sense of crossing over, of things not being purely one or the other, I think is really at the core of at least his most interesting characters, if not a whole cosmology.
Others in response to that question? Yes.
No, George Lucas'
Just to add one thing to what Scott was saying, I think, people oversimplify the Fourth World as being, quote, about good and evil. Even Doug Wolf has done this. But it was really about control versus free will. And free will can lead to lots of mistakes, and itself can lead to evil. But, Kirby had the nuanced perspective of, people having the choice and hopefully making the right one.
Shall we entertain some questions from the people who are here? Questions from the people? Yes, please.
You're talking about whether or not Kirby is an optimist or a pessimist. Could a word for him also be potentialist? For example, he tends to lean both towards the pessimistic and the optimistic, showing what a better world could be like, and also showing how others perceive the natural world to be currently. So would it be accurate to suggest that maybe he's demonstrating potentials for one side or the other?
I like that a lot, because so much of what he was doing in the 70s was a critique, of the society he saw around him, it seems to me. Mark Evanier, his biographer, has talked about how, people said, well, who was Darkseid? He said, well, it would vary. Sometimes he was Nixon, sometimes he was, Martin Goodman, or whatever. But clearly, there's always an implication of what could be better. Like when Light Ray says, I know a place where everyone's nonviolent, where, the New Genesis was always put up as like the example of what we should be. And more subtly, of course, he had The World That's Coming in OMAC, which was, ostensibly very sleek and cool, but is actually, completely cold and, something that he was afraid of. That's probably what he thought. That's probably where he thought we were going, and New Genesis is probably where he thought we should be going. But the kernel was there. I agree with you.
Others in response to that question? Or, Jose, question?
Yeah, hi. So I came very late Kirby, in fact, and it was work that really didn't speak to me as a kid, and I kind of pondered why that is, and it's illuminating. But I'm curious about how you guys feel about Kirby's engagement with his own times, particularly in that period, in the 70s. You've referenced some of this, but in particular, his treatment of maybe utopian, maybe dystopian, but his treatment of diversity for example, Ben, you alluded to, for example, kind of doing a transgender kind of move without necessarily maybe pursuing it to its logical ends in some sense. In particular, its treatment of racialized kind of types, and how there's this wonderful kind of sense about how Kirby in that work is very much ahead of his time, but there's also all these weird retrograde kind of elements, like in Black into Black, or Flip a Dippa, or stuff like that. Kind of like,
Yeah, I have to flip it in.
so I'm just curious, yeah, fascinating what you guys think about that side of Kirby in the 70s. Was this maybe a place that's maybe more open to kind of
There's a character in the fourth world named Sunny Sumo,
yes.
and he's a sort of badly orange-colored, vaguely Asian brick house of a man, and he is a sumo wrestler, and he really is built like a house. On the one hand, this is a complete cliche, right? Sunny Sumo. Kirby decides to introduce an Asian character. On the other hand, there's something cosmic and sort of beyond comprehension about Sunny Sumo. He's got a cosmic secret in his brain. He's a character of great nobility. He's a character that's got inside him whatever it is that the bad guy, Darkseid, wants. But Sunny himself is really like an undiluted vision of the good. And to me, that's sort of a textbook example of that. That the character seems at first blush like maybe even a little embarrassing or a very dated kind of character, but there's a sense that this character is bearing around inside of something that's larger than everybody else. Right? It's kind of hard to describe unless you read those comics. So realism's got nothing to do with it, but there's a sense in which he's trying to exalt this character. And if he had his druthers, or if there'd been an opening in the schedule, or if DC had asked, he probably would have cooked up a Sunny Sumo comic book, This is kind of how the Black Panther originated, this same kind of the spontaneous response to the times. Anyone else have that question?
Yeah, the Kirby I think of as definitely transitional, but he went further than a lot of comic creators of his generation. I mean, he was vocally remorseful about stereotypes that he participated in Golden Age comics in ways that it took Will Eisner, supposedly much more sophisticated, decades longer to come to terms with. The signature story for me is Milo Minute Jones from The Losers, which was not cosmic but was war stories, and it's about this Jesse Owens type figure who ends up in a race with the now Nazi German who he faced in the Olympics. And there's this one scene that really struck me, and I didn't realize why at the time, as a kid reading it, where like they end up actually in a race again, and like it's like a white line that gets them through a minefield, and that they're like kind of hallucinating as like the old lines on the track where they first met as allies. And Milo Minute Jones says, "I'll show you that a black man can win." And like at the time I thought, wow, this is pretty untheoretical, and basic. But I realized that Kirby was approaching race with a rawness, that it really is a conflict between, people with unequal rights, in ways that a lot more self-conscious writers like Denny O'Neil were really kind of twisting themselves into knots and being self-congratulatory or like inadvertently insulting, where Kirby just had that direct, sense of conflict, which he knew of from when he was brawling with other ethnic groups that weren't him, on the Lower East Side. So I think he had an honest conception of it, but, very transitional in terms of being fully enlightened about it.
It's a really good question, and it's a difficult one, I think. And I'm very acutely conscious that, we all seem to be like over 40 white guys sitting here. And I think it's something we really tried to address in the book, actually, in terms of the catalog, and that we were self-conscious about trying to make sure that we had some articles by women, and we had some articles by people of color in the catalog, because my own belief is that I'm a practitioner of a certain kind of ideological and political criticism, and I sort of came of age in an era of increased awareness of the vital importance of considering questions of difference when engaging in critical work. And at the same time, I have a a sufficiently residually humanist sort of faith, as unfashionable as it is, that there are artists who can speak to everybody. And I want to believe that Kirby's one of those artists. I think that he didn't like bullies. And I think that he had a deep investment and interest in the experience of being or being made to feel marginal. I think that his own deep conflicts around this are apparent in his renaming himself. You know, Joe Simon tells this story about you know, why are you? Joe Simon confronting him with Jack Kirby as a name, saying, "Why you know, don't you like? Are you ashamed of to be identified as Jewish? You know?" And Kirby, almost not understanding in his trust, saying, "What? You don't like Jack Kirby as a name? You know, like not getting it." And then when you read about, the more I learn about the life, what I see, especially the relationship with Joe Simon, is a very clear version of it. This was a man who consistently did not recognize his own worth. Kirby consistently throughout his own career is underpaid, and felt like he needed someone like Joe in the early days to sort of negotiate the business angle of things, because he just wanted to get down to the business of drawing. He bristled at the suggestion that he had changed his name because of some embarrassment over his own Jewishness. But he changed his name, right? Because there was a sense in which Jack Kirby could do anything. J.T. Kurtzberg, I don't know whether he can do what Jack Kirby can do. There's a Woody Allen line from one of the later, middle period movies now. The character accuses him of being a self-hating Jew, and he says, "Don't say that. I hate myself, but not because I'm Jewish." There's an aspect of that to Kirby's own personality. That Kirby absolutely was not at all ashamed of his Jewishness, but he was nonetheless at some level ashamed of who he felt worried that he didn't measure up.
It's a class thing, right?
It's a class thing.
He would say, I looked up to Joe because Joe was a middle-class guy, and I didn't know any middle-class guys when I grew up. That's what he said.
Even knowing how to order things in a restaurant, you know, that kind of insecurity. And so I think that part of it, when it wasn't a source of bitterness and insecurity, it was a source of empathy and relation.
Yeah.
And I think that we can see, you know, and all of these things in the end are relative. People, even when the Fantastic Four is about a New York that doesn't seem to have any ethnicities in it, there are actually there are these moments of identification. This is an anecdotal thing from Tom Orzechowski, who says when he grew up in Detroit and went to a mostly black school and was friends with a lot of kids, they bonded over the Fantastic Four, and the character that a lot of his black friends liked the best was the Thing. Now, does that make, there's both tragedy and power there, right? It's tragedy that a community can be so underrepresented in the culture that you identify with the rocky orange monster, because you never actually get to see anyone who looks even remotely like you. So on the one hand, it's kind of criminal, and it's not something to celebrate. On the other hand, Kirby was thinking about what it meant to really look different, and to feel isolated and regarded. You know, there's a long history in the racist culture of this country of making monsters out of people who look different. And Kirby's latching onto that and running with that and using that. So I think within the context of his own historical moment, I have no doubt, there's no doubt in my mind that if Kirby had lived, that he would be on the same side as all of the rest of us on these progressive issues.
Well, I was just saying, and Kirby identified as the Thing. I mean, he basically had a self-portrait as the Thing.
Yeah.
So the Thing, he identified as the monster. So.
Yeah, look for the story called Street Code in the gallery, which shows Jack in his 60s, recalling what it was like 60 years before, to be really a poor kid on the streets of the Lower East Side, which is, you know, one of the most crowded neighborhoods on earth at that time. It's a place of real privation and struggle, and you can really get a sense of that marginality. You had a question for us.
Right, a comment.
Yeah.
Some thoughts. My name is David Schwartz. I knew Jack. I knew Jack well for about 10 years. And the thing I wanted to add to what you guys were saying is that first and foremost, when it came to his work, Jack was a storyteller. Even when he drew pictures on his wall that were display pieces, if you asked him what the picture meant, he would go into some lengthy story about explaining everything about the picture. Now, whether that was something that was by design or just because you asked, he was going to do so, he was always thinking in his head. He didn't drive. Basically, his wife drove, Roz drove, because there's a story about in Thousand Oaks, he was driving once down the street from where he lived, and he was thinking of some story, and he ran into a police car. That was hard. And so Jack didn't drive because he was constantly thinking of things. And when you were talking about how the Sunny Sumo and the different characters that were at first simplistic, but also had way more to them when you actually explored the characters, the thing about Jack's work, in my opinion, is that it had real depth, so that you could appreciate it on all sorts of different levels. And I think that's also part of the reason it sustains itself so well as all of us have grown up, because as children we were able to read it on one level, and then as adults we can reread it and go, oh my gosh, there's so much more here than we had originally thought. And my last point, I don't think I'm too much time, is that Jack really revered, or revered may be the wrong word, Jack really was very really good with kids. What happened was in the 60s and 70s, when he was doing, as you guys said, all of these pages, people would find their way to his house because he was Jack Kirby and people admired him. And instead of just cursory, like, hello, how are you? You know, him and Roz, his wife Roz, they'd invite these kids in, they'd feed them, they would, you know, and all of a sudden he'd have kids coming up, the kids who came from San Diego, that started help found the San Diego Convention. He put them in, which book do you guys know? He puts them in the Jimmy Olsen book. So he's got these kids coming up to his house who are in this club, who he's not only entertaining, he's taking time away from his work, etc. And then he puts them in the comic books. I mean, he really was very good with that kind of making everybody family. And that's just part and parcel of who he was. And I think a lot of that is represented, like in The New Gods and in Forever People, is just very well represented.
So you want to go on it?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on that a little bit too. I used to work for Malibu Comics, which was in Thousand Oaks, and Jack Kirby actually made a trip to our office and had toured our office, and he invited the whole art department to his house, and every week, you know, up until like, you know, maybe about a week before he passed away, we would go to his house, and we would, you know, he would just tell us stories. And that was our thing on Wednesdays. We would go to the comic book store, and then we would go to his house for lunch, and Ross would make us lunch, and we would just kind of just hang out there, and he would just tell us stories. And stories about everything. And he would even give us the artwork, a lot of his pages. But then you have Ross standing right at the front. Taking it, he's like, no, you can't leave it. So yeah, that's what we used to do also. And he always welcomed us in until towards the end when Ross said he's not feeling good, you know, you guys have to come back next time. So, and that's how it was for us. But you know, maybe like the whole 6 months to a year that I was at Malibu from 93 to 95, you know, and we would all do that. So that was a really fun time in my life too. So I just, on what he just said about Jack welcoming everybody into his house, and he did that for everybody. And we would have, you know, at least a good 10 of us would be over the house, and we would sit there and he would just talk and we would just listen, you know. And then we went back to work and all hyped and stuff, and you know, and so that was a good period.
Hey, Kevin?
Something that has been really been touched on is a little devil advocate thing here. Kirby's Fourth World was just amazing. It was just amazing. I loved it when I first read it. I got the honor to assistant edit on Mr. Miracle and write Mr. Miracle. But when it was first posited that we restart New Gods and Mr. Miracle, we're told by the powers that be, Kirby's DC work never sell. And indeed, if you look at New Gods and if you look at Forever People, they didn't even last a year. Some people have averred that he never really sold well on his own, by himself, that he always needed somebody else in order to sell well. And that just freaked me out. I'm sorry. I go, what do you mean? But this is the New God. This is Kirby. How can you say that? And unfortunately, it bears out that it didn't sell well. And I love the panels.
Well, I just have a quick response to that,
Yeah.
which is that you could see that as someone who was not as much in touch with the comics buying public as people that he collaborated with, perhaps. But you could also make the case, which I think is borne out by the show and the panel and all of this, that it demonstrates his idiosyncrasy. It demonstrates the way in which he was true to some internal sense of what he wanted to do. And if that wasn't selling, I'm sure he was not happy about that, but I also don't think that that was the ultimate goal, was to figure out ways to boost his sales.
But the other point is that, like Fantastic Four sold so well with Kirby and Lee. And
But, I mean,
some people said he doesn't sell well on his own.
When we think about comic books, we think about something where the sales figures sort of become the source of validation, right? All of us play this game, especially in Los Angeles, where we watch the box office receipts of movies that we want to do well, and see, whether they do, whether the receipts accord with our taste or judgment, as if those numbers are some kind of referendum on our taste. There's some kind of validation on our taste. I mean, New Gods didn't sell in Fantastic Four numbers, but it still outsold, I bet, almost any comic book published today, 40-odd years later, right? So these things are kind of I think, relative to context, right? And we see how generative. It's funny how DC canceled New Gods and Forever People within less than 2 years, and then within 5 years sought to revive them, and sought to revive them again and again and again, often without much long-term success. Doug?
I just wanted to point out how with the Fourth World, I think the only sort of vaguely conventional superhero was Mr. Miracle, who had like a superhero name and some powers that a typical adolescent might think were cool, but with Jimmy Olsen and the Newsboy Legion, and then the Forever People and the New Gods was like, how many of them were there? It was like, they're gods, it was all, they were all very, they weren't invisible for all or whatever, so I think maybe Kirby was deliberately trying to expand the mythological vocabulary of the superhero genre, and it wasn't allowed to play out. It might have caught on if it could have been allowed to stretch out a little bit, but it just wasn't, immediately hitting that.
Well, I think also something that the show bears out as well is that Kirby on his own was rougher, more raw, and less pretty. I think when he died, Neil Gaiman made the point that Kirby was a great artist, but he was not a pretty artist. And so this is really unlovely work in some way. It's not the slickness that Joe Sennett gave Kirby with his inks. It's not as smooth, or edges are not smoothed down. But I think that's the way he wanted it. And I think it's why, surprisingly enough, when I go back to read the Marvel books, I find Stan Lee's writing, which I used to really, valorize, almost unreadable. And I find Kirby's writing, which I used to excoriate, really bracing and intriguing to me. So I just think that there was something going on other than the drive for commercial acceptance. That, maybe he wasn't happy about at the time, but is probably the reason we're here.
I think we have time for a couple of other questions or comments, and I've seen a couple of hands. Fran?
I just wanted to talk a little briefly about the comic book business at the time. Was that
comic books were being distributed on the newsstand.
This is Rand Hoppy of the Jack Kirby Museum and Research Center, by the way.
They were being distributed on the newsstand, and at the time there was a burgeoning development of fan comic book dealers who would go into the newsstand distributors and take bales or packages of comics out of the warehouse, and those were not reported as being sold. Money was exchanged, but they weren't reported sold to the comic book publishers. And there's one particular scholar, comic book dealer, Bob Bierbaum, who has reported that in his experience, there were any number of Jack Kirby comics that were taken out of the distributors, being Forever People and New Gods, and for some reason Mr. Miracle was not as desired by the comic book dealers. And wouldn't you know that it was Mr. Miracle that had the good numbers that kept on, but New Gods and Forever People, which were the ones that numbers weren't being reported accurately, were the ones that were canceled. So that actually the comics were being reported by the distributors as being destroyed and not sold, whereas they were actually making it to the comic book fan market.
I'll follow up Adam and then this gentleman over here.
Sure, and of course, Paul Levitz has, proclaimed a lot that he looked back at the sales figures, and DC thought they were going to get Superman-like numbers from Kirby, so they ordered, quantities that then made it seem like a failure. But it also has to do with the churn of popular taste. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, you were talking about alternatives to the superhero mythos. I mean, Kirby's most unqualified hit at the time was Commandy, which was very far afield of the typical, superhero mythos. And also, I mean, there's been a telling and very depressing quote from Carmine Infantino when he's justifying canceling the Fourth World, saying, the college kids were really flaking out over it. He means freaking, but whatever. But it just didn't have the sales like among the kids. And of course, nowadays you would think, let us target that niche, let us select that audience. But that wasn't the mentality of the times.
Sir, over here.
Yes, you were talking earlier about Kirby's roughness. But earlier in his career, he was known for the romance comics, which, romance is in a bit of a revival right now. I was wondering if you could talk about some of his goodwill art and when he was really drawing the romance genre.
Well, we know this thanks to a scholar named Harry Mendrick, who worked with Joe Simon even in recent years before Joe Simon, Kirby's longtime partner, passed away. We know that between about 1947 and 57, a decade later, that Jack Kirby drew more pages of romance than he did of any other genre, and in fact of all the other genres he worked on combined during that period. And we know too, we've talked about this before, some of us, that romance enabled Kirby and Joe Simon to buy houses in the suburbs, right, in Long Island. Kirby moved his family from Brooklyn to Long Island and had a house next door or right across the street from his partner Joe, and romance did that, because the romance comics that they published with their publisher called Press really did that. We don't tend to think about